comes into neighborhoods, you see incredible displacement as property values and rents rise around the transit, and people who own more cars and ride transit less move in. So we decided to work on citywide policy, land use policy, to achieve what the city wasn't doing, to stabilize, fight against displacement around the transit build out and stabilize communities. And it was rough, you know, like our organizations, which were largely housing advocates, some active transportation advocates as well, and other sort of environmental groups, but largely housers, like we didn't have political juice. Our city council has not produced substantive housing policy for the city of LA in 15 years. There's not the political will, and we couldn't garner it with our positioning politically. And so one of the many partners that we talked to in the course of like reaching out to allies was organized labor. And in conversations with organized labor, it's clear that organized labor cares a lot about housing. People would talk about, you know, being in affiliate meetings with the, you know, union workers who talk about housing, their needs, their family members' needs, and the real viability for organized labor to operate politically is challenged when union members can't afford to live in the city of LA anymore. They're getting pushed out. So the organized labor was really, the County Federation of Labor, was under the leadership of Rusty Hicks, was really starting to think a lot about how to support the housing movement. And we clearly know, you know, as housing advocates, that economic development and opportunities for quality and career track jobs is a critical part of the solution to housing. And so it was late last fall that we really seized an opportunity that we identified to move a housing and jobs initiative and put it before the voters of Los Angeles. And our Build Better LA initiative, which is on the ballot, very close to the end of the ballot, right underneath Prop HHH, is Prop JJJ. There's an opportunity for every resident of the city of LA to vote for it on November 8th. And you know what? I've been working hard on JJJ since we put the coalition together last fall, and not only do I think it's important that it's an initiative that puts responsibility on private developers to do what's fair and ensure that there's a mix of affordable housing in their developments, and that there's a production of good jobs in the building of those residential properties, but also we have built a coalition that can change policy in the city of LA. The city council has reacted. They have been very unhappy about what we've done, and there's not a lot they can do about it. Because we just went out and got 100,000 signatures and we put it on the ballot, and we're now running the only real ground operation in the city of LA for this election cycle. And we picked up HHH. So we're also on the doors and on the phones every day, right now, as we speak. There's people making calls, and you all are going to come out and door knock with us. Oh, Kiara, here we go. There we go. Kiara's going to start handing out information. And anybody wants to do phone banking or on the doors with us over the next week, Kiara has information that's going to hand it out. And it is both JJJ and HHH. And to change the politics in this city around, like, what does it look like to unite across sectors, really to bring people together who somehow people think that workers and people who don't have stable and affordable housing are somehow different, and that is not true. We're all the same people. And we have, we've really shaken things up right now in politics in the city, and so please come out. There's my big plug. Come out for JJJ and HHH this weekend and next weekend, and get everyone you know out to vote. And just to say, we only need 50% for JJJ, which we need, but we need 67% for HHH. It is essential that we get the votes for HHH. So please get your friends to the polls and vote for that.
All right.
Yeah, I wanted to.
The question is over what's positive.
Yeah, and what do you think would be game-changing strategy or interventions?
I guess let me just begin by giving a really brief description of something that perhaps a large portion of the audience isn't aware of. In massive parts of the city of Los Angeles, the homeless, the people experiencing homelessness on the streets of this community, we've been counting them. We've been interviewing them now for almost 10 years, getting information from them. And in that information we've collected, we've learned that in some portions, very large sections, over 60% of the people who are on the streets are experiencing some level of mental illness. Over 60%. If you go back to the beginning of the Reagan administration, the deinstitutionalization of mental health hospitals, big ones, led to what eventually would have been community mental health centers that were never established, that basically led to where we are now, where over half of the people who are living on the streets struggle with mental illness. Twin Towers, the big jail that's over there next to Olvera Street by the train station, is, by all accounts, the largest mental health institution west of the Mississippi. And this is a jail, folks. I say this to you because in order to address homelessness, besides building housing and besides putting an army of people like us to help these folks in housing, there are pieces of the system that need to be corrected and that need to find some semblance of order in order for human beings to find peace or to find treatment that's appropriate for them when it's appropriate for them. The notion that I can go into a clinic with a person who's schizophrenic and hear 16 voices, to have a psychiatric evaluation done, and that they're told come back in 3 months for your first appointment, is unacceptable. And has been unacceptable, and I believe has contributed significantly to why we have the number of homeless folks experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles. A major game changer that we're all really looking at right now is the fact that the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health has brought in a very wise and understanding individual from San Francisco called Dr. Katz, who is restructuring the way the mental health system works in Los Angeles. Their former director was politely nudged aside, and we are now in the presence of a new person who has, for all accounts, seen our faces, talked to us, and understands that major changes need to occur in the way a person who is poor accesses service through these clinics. We won't necessarily just sit on our hands and cross our fingers and hope it works, but we will sit there as advocates in the offices and help instruct and provide guidance to them so that they recognize that it's not necessarily about a person walking into a clinic, perhaps as getting your clinicians out and being mobile to encourage people by encountering them on the streets. So again, I just use that as a small portion of the complex picture to indicate to you that it's something we feel positive about.
That's great. I appreciate that both of you actually lifted up the intersection between the issues that you supposedly work on and all of the other issues, from economic justice to health and well-being. And one of the things that has been really important for the program at Antioch and the Masters in Urban Sustainability is really leaning into that complexity and looking at the interrelatedness of all of the different kind of aspects of health and well-being and community life. One of the big things we talk about in the movement that in the organizing that I do, people often talk about workers in communities, as if workers don't actually live in communities. And so these are just like patterns that we've picked up and that continue to play out in our organizing. So I just want to really appreciate that both of you are in the opportunity to talk about what could change or what could shift, lifted up dimensions of the issue that folks most often don't think about, like the relationship to organized labor or health. I want to take a different tack for the next question, because I think it's kind of just would be wonderful to know how you all got into this work. Like what actually motivated you or inspired you, or what was the spark that said, oh my goodness, this is what I'm going to end up doing for the rest of my life, or at least for the rest of the next big portion of it.
I think I mentioned it to some of the folks yesterday. I fell into this profession by accident. My schooling has nothing to do with social work, poverty, or organizing. I studied Spanish at Cal State LA to become a Spanish interpreter. I needed to pay tuition So I went to a nonprofit in El Monte that needed a Spanish speaker to do assessments with people who were experiencing homelessness. And I was basically exposed to a world that I never really knew existed. I was raised a pretty strict Catholic kid at private schools that often sent us in Thanksgiving to feed people. But my crossover with the poor never exceeded beyond that. When I came home after the first week of work there, I felt this really strange, feeling of needing to go back there as quickly as possible and needing to make myself comfortable in an environment that allowed me to be part of it. I relied quite heavily on my upbringing, by my book, by my parents, by what they taught me, but most importantly by those peers around me that had been doing this work for many years before I joined. I would be in a van encountering people in the neighborhoods where I grew up with the goal of getting them connected to something that they could not communicate or ask for on their own account. I often wonder how for me it's amazing that over 15 years have passed. For me the trouble is that in 15 years I see portions of the city that haven't changed. I see portions of the city that look exactly the same way they did when I started 15 years ago. That's what compels me to stay here. Because I'd be a fool to believe that we're going to get up one day and not see any single homeless people. But I shouldn't go to sleep with the thought that I can't see portions of neighborhoods that I've spent a lot of time in, at least have some semblance of order or structure that could direct people the right way. So for me and for many like me that I think I speak on behalf of, it's just a fire we have that basically wakes us up every morning and takes us to work.
Shortly after college, I returned to my hometown of Seattle and started volunteering with an adult literacy program. And within a few years, I was honored to have the job of running what was a community school where adults came to learn to read and write and turned around and started teaching other people pretty quickly to read and write. And I was really young. And lots of the folks there were not young at all. And I could read and write really well, and I didn't know how to do a lot else. And we ran that place together. And, that was really my first set of teachers. And it was clear to me that as we use the texts of people's lives to be the actual material from which they learn to read and write, it was clear that we were creating an analysis together about what were the conditions that had created the problems where people could come to adulthood and not be able to read and write in this country. And so we had that perspective, but what we didn't know really as a group was how to then move to make change to those systems. And so I had the idea I would come to LA and go to urban planning school at UCLA, study with Gilda and other great folks there, and then go back to Seattle. That got back to Seattle part didn't quite work. I ended up getting sucked in to LA. It's one of the thing I did when Gilda hired me before I even got here was to work on the Community Scholars Program. And I can't imagine a better instructional experience than dropping into a new city, which is Los Angeles, and meeting a group of community organizers from across the city. And getting to work with them over, two sets of them over a 2-year period, and so I got exposed to organizing work, and I started to understand it, and I was mentored by Gilda and other people and what it is to organize, and had a front row seat to some of, I think, the most, high quality and complex organizing work that's being done in the country. Right here in our city, and that's where I am now. Led me to this work.
I wanted to ask one other question before we open it up to the group. This actually really specifically for you. You got a chance at the very end to mention HHH. You mentioned HHH. Maybe every other person in the room is from LA and knows what we're talking about, but I don't. So I wanted to hear actually the details of HHH. You laid a little bit about JJJ, but there may be other propositions that, or other things that are coming forward that you all want to uplift, and actions that people take to support the work.
Right, I think I'm going to simplify it, and I'm pretty confident that there's probably folks in the audience who could probably describe it better than I would, but this bond initiative basically ensures that dollars that would be collected from a property tax increase to property owners in the city of Los Angeles would go to the express purpose of actually building affordable housing. That we are in the presence of a group of leaders and a group of residents who feel compelled to go to these measures only because the funding necessary to ensure that enough developments are actually built require a massive influx of dollars that is not presently available, that is necessary. I think it's important to recognize, and I skimmed over it really quickly, that this is something that would require additional resources. There's a county measure that will become available in March that will also serve as a companion to this. But the significance here has to do with the fact that there must be some investment from those who live and reside in the city to recognize the need to house those individuals who are neighbors and who literally live within feet or inches in some cases of where these folks are. This includes me. This includes many of the people I work with and many of my family. So I think it's significant, it's necessary, and it's something we really do hope folks turn out for. Because like she says, it's not as simple. It requires a 67% majority, so we're hoping for the best.
Can I just add, it's 1.2 billion that'll be raised. It should house around 10,000 people. 70% of it will be spent specifically on homeless, and the other 30% on stabilizing families so that they don't move into homelessness. And it's only, for the average homeowner, about $33 a year. So about a cup of coffee a month. And it's a good investment for all of us.
And if you actually do believe that housing is a human right, then you have to be willing to actually organize our collective resources towards that purpose. You can't have it both ways, right?
Yeah.
And that actually, when you talked about housing people first, that would really confirmed that for me, because if you start with the premise that housing is a right, then you provide for that right. Then everything else is organized around making sure that right is secured. And that's where you provide all of the additional services or all of the additional support, or you marshal the resources collectively of our community, whether it's through taxes or whether it's through agencies, to actually ensure that the right is actually defended and protected. And so it's sort of, there is a fundamental value shift, a story shift that is embedded in all of your work, which is, it is really about beginning from the place that people have a right to remain in their communities, that the right to housing precedes the right to make money off of speculating on soil, that if we believe that people have these rights, then we have an obligation to both resource them and support them. So they begin with a fundamentally different framework than the dominant narrative, and the work, I think itself, which of course is, you're homeless because it's your fault, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get a better job, everybody should try and get ahead, regardless of who gets left behind. So I think I just want to uplift the importance of the storytelling in your work, and the fact that it is as much about changing material conditions as it is about changing the way we see each other in the world. So I wanted to just uplift that and what I heard from both of you. And with that, I'm going to actually open it up for folks from the audience who want to ask questions or share other experiences and stories. We will look for hands if people have questions or comments they want to share. And I see your hand, Catherine, and I'm gonna look for hands, and when I see several hands, then I will pick who I want to pick. Great. Yeah, I see Hussein. Hussein, is that right? Yeah. Hussein, why don't you go, and then Catherine, you can go next.
Quick question. Do you have any strategies to, when folks to get them motivated to work out there in society? Because in my view, it's not all about housing these people, but also get them motivated back to work and back to society.
Right, you bring up a very good point. The way the structure has been set up when you house an individual has always been focused around the medical needs, around whether this person wants to go to treatment to address their addiction. Sometimes they're duly diagnosed and they're using substances to address mental health issues. And it's often been always perceived as a very clinical thing that always relies on the ability to ensure that this person is healthy and that they're living in an environment in a healthy way. We at Housing Works have recently started on a trail, on an effort, if you will, that addresses the very question you brought up. We find that if a person in a setting where they're suddenly housed, they're suddenly stable, and they've been there for 18 months or 3 years, has from time to time the skill set, the education, and the background, whether it because they were employed at some point, or because they enjoy writing, or because they enjoy something in their lives that motivates them, to connect them, to act as a bridge, to get them connected to some level of involvement in the community. We call it Empowerment Works. And we've adopted this because we truly believe it's the next phase in this. We believe that it's necessary to see what we can possibly do to act as conduits or connections or bridges to the opportunities if a person can be employed. It should be understood that a good portion of the folks that we house are very ill, come to us from hospitals, and quite literally will require care for the rest of their lives. But you do have some folks who came from careers, some folks who were incredibly gifted and had talented skills that they used in order to gain employment at some point. And more often than not, those are the folks that once they feel settled and they feel like they have a place they can come back to, can be connected to something quite simple. Empowerment works on that goal. It doesn't necessarily have to be just for money-making opportunities so that they can gain employment, but it can also be for the opportunity to volunteer or to feel in need of being present somewhere in a community where they're involved. So for us, again, it's our next frontier. Like if we were NASA, that would be us going to Mars. We want to make sure that the folks we've housed have the opportunity to reintegrate through their skills or through their talent.
Thank you for lifting up that it doesn't have to just be about quote unquote getting a job, because I think there is an overall story or a tendency to say, if we're going to provide you a house, then you should have to go get a job and get work and earn money. And that misunderstands the meaning of the term right.
Right.
Like the only qualification for housing, if it's a human right, is that you are in fact a human being. And all of the other things are important because being able to be a productive, contributing member of the community is something that gives us all meaning.
Right.
But but that's different than this idea of like you get to keep your housing because you have a job. So I wanted to appreciate that. I saw Catherine and then yeah,
My name's Azita.
Adita. Great.
Yeah, my question is kind of surrounding the agricultural incentives, because, I mean, we do have a lot of land displacement and the way we use our land is a huge thing. The AB 551 urban ag incentive, maybe you guys know about it, we talked about that a little bit too. But like, I know we're trying to get people housed and people reassembled in like safe places, but I mean like reintegrating them maybe with the agriculture, really getting them back onto the land. Can you like talk about what your organizations are doing to get that on the game ball?
You know, I'm afraid that from Housing Works' perspective, it's something I'm not necessarily sure we've been involved in. I understand the question you ask, and I'm afraid that I don't have an answer from our perspective as far as how we reconnect or integrate folks into that.
We're planning on, in anything that we build new, to integrate agriculture into it. So, for example, the project that I just showed you for 140 families, there'll be 40 gardening beds that is built into it. Another, there can be landscaping with fruit trees, and so those are some of the plans. So in a place where we're working on a park, it does include a community garden. Our organization has a very close partnership with LA Neighborhood Land Trust, which is an organization that was started by the city but spun off as an independent nonprofit about the same time that we were formed, a little bit before. And they are organized around small parks and gardens. And so we don't have a need to do that work ourselves because we do it in partnership. One of the things that we're doing in conjunction with LA Neighborhood Land Trust and 3 other organizations is we have a collaborative called Free Los Angeles, and we're focused on vacant land. We're in the first phase of our initiative right now, and we are working towards city policy to create community access to city-owned vacant lots, of which there are thousands across the city. And we're making great progress. Like really, we've got the city committed to a pilot project to actually create opportunities for communities to get into city-owned vacant lots. So that's really exciting. We do lot activations. We actually take over lots and design them with communities and do planning around them and envision, the community can envision what can happen there. And so one of the main interests that community members have as we've talked to people about this is conversion of lots into agricultural land. And our goal after we get the city policy taken care of is to start working on privately owned vacant lands. And that's the next step. So yeah, that's our...
And I'll speak to that a little bit because that's actually that's related to the work that I do at Movement Generation in the Bay Area. When we say the Bay, we mean San Francisco Bay Area, because there are no other bays.
Except the one down here.
Yeah, whatever. So just a couple of things I would lift up. So one thing that we do, we have a program called Permaculture for the People where we do a 2-week intensive permaculture design course, but it's all in urban environments and it's all with grassroots community-based organizers. And so through that project, we've both worked with nonprofit organizations that are doing land and housing combined work. So Poder in San Francisco, people organized to demand environmental and economic rights. Poder has won a huge development project that will be community controlled, that will be land trust housing, but that will also have a small urban farm that will be that the community is in a participatory permaculture design process around. And I think one of the central things here is the idea that people actually engaged in the work is part of what helps them build. Like, how do you build permanently organized communities? It's people having a meaningful relationship to the land, to the place, to each other, and to having their needs met in that way. So that's one example. We work with Urban Tilth in Richmond, California, which is taking over Public Greenway. So these are some of the more interesting pieces of vacant land where it's not you can't actually it's not suitable for, say, housing development, but it is, it's very, very suitable for block by block community agriculture, community-based agriculture. So large areas of land that can be, it's a former railroad track, it's now a greenway, that's all being turned into urban food access. And the one thing I wanted to lift up from LA is the single largest piece of continuous vacant land, tell me if I'm getting this right, is still the former South Central farm, and that still is undeveloped, and there's a struggle over whether it's going to become a factory and a warehouse or whether it can be turned back into a farm. And so that was the struggle that was referenced at the beginning of this evening, and I think is for locally, a really great opportunity. It's in a quote unquote industrial zone in terms of what it's slated for, is my understanding. Oh, you're still here to talk about it.
Rosa.
Oh no, is my eyes?
No,
That's my eyes, sorry. So it's zoned for industrial, so it's not suitable for housing. And where it is, it wouldn't be appropriate, but it would be appropriate for a large-scale, community-controlled urban farm. So those are the kind of opportunities, I think, that are worth looking for. I'm interested in some of the sidewalk opportunities, like that little micro garden stuff. But just to say that I think there are, and you brought up something that I thought was interesting in the terms of the when you got the transit-oriented development folks together with the housing folks, and you were struggling to try and like make progress in that. One of the things that we did in Oakland that is similar, but I think interestingly enough we got a lot of traction, was energy and climate action planning. Every city in the country is going to have to do energy and climate action planning because, guess what, climate change demands it. And so it is actually an opportunity to change everything. So we brought transit folks together with housing folks, like Casa Justa Just Cause, together with urban ag folks, together who are interested in urban farm issues, together with zero waste, together with local clean energy folks, and created a large platform that addressed all of those issues and negotiated these questions around, if we're going to have transit-oriented development, we need renter protection, for example, in order to ensure that transit-oriented development doesn't lead to displacement of more cars. And it was an opportunity to build a broad coalition and to move it, and we actually won a really good city-level policy. And then, of course, the question is, how do you pay for it? And that's the big struggle. So, in the way back and then up front.
To ask if you could address that when you have low income and the person needs affordable housing, and even with low income, if there isn't a subsidy when they break the ground, there will not be sufficient subsidy. So I think in the past, the very rich were able to contribute something, and sometimes as a tax break or deduction. And therefore, there was a possibility of more subsidy from when the ground's broken. Could you address that a little bit?
That's a good point. I think, let me just really quickly describe what allows us to house a person. Because you have, I'm going to really simplify this, so just bear with me. You have some folks who have absolutely no income at all, who don't have a dime, don't receive any benefits from the government, and basically are just, relying on the kindness of someone to give them a meal. You have some folks who receive general relief, which is welfare, in the form of either cash aid and food stamps, which is typically $221 a month cash, and about $175 a month in food stamps, which is just a little card that allows them to go into a store and buy groceries. You have some folks who receive Social Security benefits, whether through SSI, Social Security Administration for, let's say, a disability, or because of their age, because they're above the age of 62. And typically that depends quite heavily on whether the person was employed or not during their years that they worked. And that factors into whether the person receives what we generally consider a low amount, which is like about $700 a month Social Security, to a person who was employed quite heavily and had some substantial income and possibly gets up to $1,200 a month. So I've just given you a really brief breakdown of what money is. And if you consider those numbers I gave you, none of them equal $2,800 a month rent. None of them equal what you typically see the cost of an apartment in the city of Los Angeles. So we rely quite heavily on something that was never available to us 10 years ago, but suddenly has become available in mass quantities to us, which is the use of a housing subsidy. And this could be a housing subsidy through the city of Los Angeles or through the county of Los Angeles. And these housing subsidies always come with a set of conditions. Have you had a subsidy before? Have you been evicted? Oh, if you did, you don't qualify for one for 5 to 8 years. Have you ever been convicted of arson? Are you a registered sex offender? Have you ever been convicted of cooking meth, crystal meth? So you start to see that to get the subsidy, you have to prove eligibility based on a different set of factors. But assuming, again, that you're a person who, for whatever reason, whether because you were evicted and because you have zero income, how do you get into an apartment? Because we have housed a significant portion of our individuals in housing without a dime in their pocket and without the use of a subsidy. And this is really quite dramatic for us because it's because of the shift in the county. I go back to the Department of Health Services, which recognized that a good portion of those individuals lingering in their emergency rooms were very expensive to them. They came up with a concept called Housing for Health, which basically used county money from the Board of Supervisors to pay rent. It's the thing called the, I'm sorry, I'm having a brain moment here. basically there's a subsidy, there's money available through the fund from the county that says if you are a person who has been recognized as chronically homeless and a frequent user, it's called a Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool, FHSP. These are dollars that are literally dedicated only to housing. We can walk up to a landlord with the use of FHSP, the Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool, and say to the landlord, yes, we have the tenant, we're the provider, will you rent to this person? They say yes, and the check, believe it or not, comes directly from the county. So the Department of Health Services is literally paying rent for a number of people in the county. And one would say, how on earth or why? Because believe it or not, they realize that it's much less expensive than allowing this person to be transported to the emergency room 6 times a month, like so many of them often do. So I guess to answer your question, we really do rely on what channels are available to us through the eligibility of each single individual, but also we tend to be creative, and we tend to use what's available to us whenever we recognize it's there. I will tell you, though, that it's wonderful that we have access to subsidies through the housing authorities like we do now. We're really, really grateful for their generosity and their understanding. We don't have apartments to put them in. There's nothing more heartbreaking than me having to go back after 90 days to the housing authority and say, here's your subsidy, we couldn't use it. But believe it or not, folks, it's actually happening.
Great. We'll take one more question and then we're at time. Is that right? That's what you were looking at before. Great.
This is for the Housing First. I'm a veteran, and my goal was to try and do what I could to help the transitional housing for veterans first, and then homeless afterwards. We've got some acres on LA County unincorporated, and one of the problems that you mentioned was living in the community versus transporting back and forth. Are you still considering, because my thought process was to be able to transport them to, this is about an hour and a half away, and have a transportation device just like a metro or whatever to bring them back into the community, but give them a place to stay.
So for veterans, I'm glad you asked that, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because the veteran population has, in my experience, has been by far